panel is called Abolitionist Alternatives to Legalization. And a couple of things, I want to welcome all of our students. We have students from all over, which is incredible. Let's see, Kent State University, New York University, so NYU, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, at CUNY, the University of Texas at Austin, the CUNY Graduate Center, and the Al Muslim University in India. We have a program where we provide registration fee waivers to students every year. It began last year, so please keep an eye out. The other thing that I like to mention is that our language justice has expanded this year. So we have had Spanish and English, and this year we actually have American Sign Language, so ASL, Spanish and English as well. With that, we have a Language Justice Fund, and if you check our Twitter, there is actually a Language Justice Fund poster for the 21 OBC conference. Make sure you grab it. They're for a limited time. So with that, I would like to introduce our journalist moderator, Paul Crider, and go from there. Thank you so much.
Hi, so I'm Paul Crider. I write and edit at a site called Liberal Currents, and that's about all that you need to know about me. I'm going to introduce the panelists. So we have Setareh Ghandehari, and maybe Setareh can wave. She manages the Detention Watch Network's federal advocacy team by collaborating with their membership, DWN's membership and coalition partners to advance DWN's goals in Washington, D.C. She's inspired by DWN's bold abolitionist vision and the leadership of directly impacted communities. Prior to joining DWN, Setareh was the director of the Labor and Employment Committee of the National Lawyers Guild and was previously a program associate for the Legal Orientation Program at the Vera Institute of Justice. We have Nathan Cheung, who is, and maybe Nathan can wave, he's a digital organizer at the California Immigrant Policy Center, or CIPC, where he works on the communications team and partners with the organizing team to tell stories of immigrants and to build digital communities to enhance the reach of their actions and their messages and capacity building. We have Jason Brennan, who is the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, and Ethics and Public Policy at Georgetown University. He specializes in politics, philosophy, and economics. He's the editor of Public Affairs Quarterly and an associate editor of Social Philosophy and Policy. He's the author of 15 books, including Injustice for All, America's Dysfunctional Criminal Justice System and How to Fix It, and In Defense of Openness, Global Justice as Global Freedom. And then we have Mirna Haidar, who is a queer Muslim refugee from Lebanon. They serve as the steering committee member of the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity and is the conceiver of Z Collective and lead organizer and advocacy trainer at the Arab American Association of New York in Brooklyn. Mirna is currently a CUNY Law, City University of New York student. I'm sorry, that might be out of date. Maybe they can correct me. Okay, and I want to start with Mirna, actually. So Mirna, how was your experience as, one, a refugee, and two, a queer Muslim, shape your views on immigration and borders? It looks, I have a signal that Mirna is connecting to audio. So I'm going to move to somebody else first. So Setareh, what does abolition mean to you in practice?
That's a big question. Well, yeah, first of all, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what all that my co-panelists have to say. I think in practice for me, abolition is a process, right? It's the goal. It's like the working towards liberation that obviously at Detention Watch Network, our focus is really on immigration detention. But it's so much more than one issue. And I think you can't really think about abolition in a silo. And if we don't consider all of the pieces that influence it, then we won't really, we're not really going to achieve the vision of liberation for all of our people. So what do I mean by working in a silo? I think in the immigration context, we work on detention, but it's deeply tied to deportation, right? If there's no if it wasn't for deportation, there wouldn't be detention. So it means working to abolish deportation, working to abolish immigration enforcement, working to create a migration systems that really honor the freedom of all people to move and choose, where they live and how they're able to be together with their communities. I think it's also more than that, right? Like I sometimes struggle in my work because, when you're working in immigration advocacy, it's hard it's not always intuitive to consider the other pieces that impact migration policy. So also thinking about imperialism and militarism and really capitalism, right? Because all of this is in service of supporting an economic system that relies on oppression. So I think for me, abolition is really about one, the journey, and then two, like how all of these systems impact each other and how we are constantly thinking of ways to make those connections and to do it collectively. And I think this is actually a question that has come up a lot and comes up a lot in immigration because people are fighting their individual cases, right? They're fighting their individual, fighting for their individual lives. But I think of abolition as a collectivist strategy. So, a decision that an individual may make for themselves may not be the same strategy that we pursue to achieve collective liberation. So I think sometimes, especially in the United States, we have such an individualistic mentality and such like a scarcity mentality that I think it's hard to sort of, pull back and think about collective strategy.
Okay, maybe I can go back to Mirna now. Mirna, how has your experience as a refugee and as a queer Muslim shaped your... Okay. Okay. I think we're having problems still. Very poorly. I'm going to move on to Nathan, Nathan Cheung. So how do you see abolition in the nonprofit world and in immigrant rights advocacy and in the policy space? How do these differ?
Yeah, well, I guess I could start. Well, I'll just acknowledge that I'm speaking, from the core of the empire in the United States, and my work is in the immigrant rights field. So just like acknowledging that the scope there might be a little myopic, but that's why I'm also, here to look forward to listening from everybody and building from everybody. And I could start off with kind of just maybe picking up and continuing, I think, what Setareh was talking about and what abolition means to me and the application and the work. So I think it's also about dreaming. It's about being forward thinking. It's about having an end goal and how we want to, like Setareh was talking about, take the journey to move towards there, to the end goal. And then kind of I could start off in the, I guess, policy space and in immigrant rights advocacy. I think there, it's a lot of the concrete ways in which we can apply abolitionist principles is about when we're campaign planning, thinking through what are the campaigns that we want to be a part of, what are the campaigns we want to lead, what are the coalitions that we want to build, and really ask ourselves questions like, are we reducing the harms and the power of the criminal justice, the immigration system? You know, are there concrete improvements in people's lives that would come about if we won these campaigns or these bills? How are we really building, you know, power and capacity, and are we altering the relations of power, the existing relations of power? Are we just like further kind of strengthening the systems in place? So I think that's like really important. And I can speak to like, yeah, I think in detention and deportation, there's a clearer way to message this, but I think in the policy work, it's also about how we want to message these abolitionist principles out, right, to the different stakeholders. So at CIPC, we also work on like health and public benefits or economic justice. And I think kind of the educational component there is sometimes a little different too. So thinking internally, what are the frameworks we can use to message about the work we're doing and the importance? So one thing that has been relatively successful, you know, as we began having these discussions is talking about, say, like the investment divestment paradigm, right? And the work we're doing, say, in California, ending the exclusion of undocumented folks from healthcare is about, you know, divesting from this finite like budget, state budget, and like really investing it in priorities that allow us to move towards this collective liberation. And I think in the immigrant rights space, something that I wanted to acknowledge too is about the problem of like criminal carve-outs and really being really intentional of saying no there, of not making concessions. Because I see criminal carve-outs as a reformist reform, not necessarily getting us towards abolition, but really continuing the ways and methods of exclusion that we have been so accustomed to. Yeah, and I think I could explain more later, but just a nod, I think in the nonprofit space too, it's inherently hard sometimes to live out kind of these personal values we have because of funding sources that are tied to our work, you know, in the nonprofit industrial complex, or maybe sometimes even just like internal misalignment of values in staff. But I think that points all the more to the fact that we have to be creative, strategic in the ways we build community. And also just like not have the development and fundraising world so siloed from the rest of, say, like the policy, organizing, communications work. So we collectively really understand, okay, what are the restrictions and like how can we push the envelope? So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. And Jason, so a question I have for you is there even a point to arguing for open borders or abolition when so many people, you know, just voters and citizens who aren't immigrants are really hostile to immigration?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's true that the gap between what, say, experts who study this think and what the average person thinks is gigantic. On terms of almost every aspect of this, most people are in favor of mostly closed borders. You can see this by thinking about just the kind of regime, say, the United States has with regard to Canada, how difficult it is even for a Canadian to move and live and work in the United States, including a white blonde-haired Canadian like my colleague Peter Jaworski and what it took for him to come here. So we are very, very far from a world of open borders, and ideologically, most people believe that immigration is bad for the home country unless they're skilled immigrants, and even then, mostly bad. They don't really care about the justice of global distribution of wealth. It's not something they're concerned about, and this is true on the right and the left and the center. It's only a minority of people who care about this. So you might think, well, why not just push for incremental policy changes on the margin? And one reason not to is that the space of ideas matters a lot in terms of what people are willing to consider. So if people see in front of them a very wide space and very wide range of ideas that they encounter, then their willingness to move is higher than when they only see a very, very narrow, tight space of ideas. So just from a strategic standpoint, the fact that people are exposed to open borders ideas is unlikely to make them be in favor of open borders, but it makes it more likely that they'll consider serious reforms that move in that direction. If you only offer to people the things that you think are feasible next year, they won't even seriously consider those.
Great, thanks. I had some trouble with unmuting myself there. Now, Setareh, I have another question for you. My understanding of the Detention Watch Network is it works in Washington, D.C. It has does lobbying essentially. So does abolition have any friends in Congress, in the administration? What is it like being an abolitionist of any kind, lobbying in DC?
This is a great question. You know, it's interesting. I think in terms of do we have any friends, you know, like I was mentioning before, you know, I think real abolition, you know, pulls back and looks at the big picture and not just individual issues. But obviously at Detention Watch Network, we're hyper focused on immigration detention. And I think over the last year and a half, you know, starting with the racial justice uprisings last summer, and then just in general, what was going on with COVID and how that was impacting people in jails and prisons and detention centers. We definitely saw an increase in the number of people who were supportive of abolishing immigration detention, or at least phasing it out slowly, or, you know, generally had starting to be vocal and public about sharing that end goal and that end vision. So in that respect, you know, we do have friends. There are organizations that have adopted that position that weren't there before. And I think, you know, there are members of Congress who, you know, will, you know, broadly say, yes, we agree that eventually we'd like to see immigration detention abolished. But I think what's interesting and what we've, you know, I think where we sometimes differ is about strategy and about how to get there. And let me just rewind a little bit. We have friends, but there's a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of not friends too. So, but you know, I think anyway, back to the point about strategy, I think that's really the part where it becomes difficult and there are tensions. And so, you know, after you know, over the last year and a half, we have been working on a resource to actually help us think through these questions of what are the strategies that are abolitionist versus reformist, and how do we bring the folks who are joining us in this position, like how do we bring them along with us? What is a resource that we can look to ask questions? And I think Nathan touched on some of these questions before, but we released just a week or so ago a resource that was very much inspired by the critical resistance charts of abolitionist steps versus reformist reforms. And so we really are asking ourselves three questions. You know, does this strategy reduce the scale of detention? Does it chip away at the system without creating new harms or pitting some communities against others? And does it provide immediate relief to people who are currently detained or could be detained or surveilled? And our goal is really to get a yes for each of these questions to, you know, move forward on the strategy or to be able to call it abolitionist. So I think to answer your question in terms of, you know, how we operate in the DC space, I think we're hoping that our position and being able to offer resources like this will bring people along with us. And I think that we have seen some of that impact over the last year. And I'm hoping that, you know, as I said before, like this is a journey. So how are we moving together, and how can we, you know, really push folks who are in DC, who are in the halls of power, to adopt these kinds of positions? And I don't think tools like this is enough. I should add, I think so much of this depends on the power that we're able to build as a movement. And so like, it's just wanting to recognize that, you know, the impact we're able to have in DC is very reliant on our power collectively. I'll stop there.
Okay, I have another question for Nathan. What is the role of communications work in this field, and how do you communicate abolition effectively? Do you focus on the broad picture of abolition, or do you focus on narrow policies and like narrative stories of individual immigrants?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's also like you know, I can offer some experience. I don't have a definitive answer because I think, you know, with communications work, we always have to understand that we're messaging to a lot of different people, different stakeholders who are at different stages of understanding, abolition, or even understanding what our end goal is. So while we want to move forward with people who are already on board with us, part of the goal in our work is also to change hearts and minds of those who are not yet, on board or might not understand what we're talking about yet. So I see the role of communications as potentially being very powerful, because ultimately we are the ones communicating, for example, in policy work, what policy work we're doing, why we're doing these, working on these specific policies, how we got to these policies. And I think part of it is also being accountable and understanding that, ultimately working in policy, we're accountable to people who are currently being affected or impacted by poor policy. So that's one aspect of it. And in terms of storytelling, I think we do try to seek a broad array of stories in order to communicate kind of the message of having people understand why we're taking these steps of working on these campaigns to get where we want to go. And I will say that sometimes though, things are out of our control and out of our hands. Once we decide on something, we put something out, it's kind of up to other people who have a hand in the communications too. So I give an example of the Health for All campaign, which we worked on, I think I mentioned just now, to exclude undocumented folks from healthcare in California. We were really excited to build with one of the impacted community individuals who was we're workshopping stories, making a video. They did they spoke at a press conference, and ultimately got a placement in the LA Times too. But then the reporter decided to publish the article, just framing it around quote unquote illegal immigration and his family being here illegally. So that was kind of hurtful. I think that's one example of how communications is important in the sense that it can go bad. And a second, I think folks working in communications in the nonprofit space and immigrant rights, a lot of times, a lot of the work is toolkits, right? Around messaging, around social media actions. And these very big and influential national orgs in immigration sometimes put out a lot of messaging where they just send, to a group of organizations or coalitions to ask them to take part in these actions. But a lot of times actually the framing is really poor. And I think whether we've seen in the last year, it's framing around only caring about essential workers, or kind of really still framing immigrants in terms of their contribution, their economic contribution to society and taxpayers, that kind of framing. But I just see other orgs once they see that, oh, it's coming from this big org, they don't really think about it, they just post it. And in that sense, I think that actually holds us back a lot. So yeah, I think the role of communication is pretty multifaceted in the sense that we have to be the gatekeepers of kind of external messaging. And we have a lot of discussions internally too, to think about how it is that we can develop different communications plans for different audiences to really get to where we want to go. And sorry, one last thing is just I think in policy work, understanding that the role legislators play too, and kind of the dilemma that presents. Because a lot of times what moves legislators or what makes sense to legislators might not be how we want to message around a particular thing to the broader public.
Paul, I wanted to let you know that Mirna is back and internet is going. So go for it.
Yeah, thanks. In that case, Mirna, welcome back.
Thank you.
So it strikes me that no immigration reform that could be agreed to in Congress would ever allocate visas for, say, queer Muslim activists. Do you think intersectionality naturally pushes one toward abolition over reform?
Hi everyone, I apologize again. I was listening most of the parts, and some parts were not audible to me, so if I do repeat someone's points, I do apologize sincerely. So from my end, that's a very interesting question. From my end, as a queer Muslim person who ended up being identifying as an abolitionist after coming into the States as an asylum seeker, I think the answer to this question is far from being found. And the reason I say that is because for me, abolition seems more like the end goal. And it seems like, and I believe our colleague here, Setareh, had mentioned, it's we need to make sure that we're not working towards abolition in silos, because for me, it's reform to abolition. And I say that for personal reasons as well, for reasons where I'm working currently, for example, with folks in Rikers who are incarcerated, is that if I do find a queer Muslim client, which I did have, and they want halal iftar meals, and the only way to get through that is through an actual policy reform, I will fight teeth and nail, and I will fight day and night to be able to get that policy reform for my client. But does that mean that, and there's something I want to mention is that as quote unquote abolitionists, there's a lot of internal shaming to people who are currently working with some reform. And I think we should have more discourse around who are the people who are asking for the immediate reform, and who are the people who are pushing for the abolitionist agenda in powerful places, from Congress to other organizations that has a lot of access to funding, etc. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that intersectionality definitely matters, and it taught me to land that feeling comfortable identifying as an abolitionist. And I want to acknowledge it's not a comfortable place for a lot of people, because it's hard for people to imagine to not know the answers, right? And so for me, it's my personal journey of being a queer Muslim refugee who's currently working with folks in Rikers. I am landing in an abolition space, but I'm also recognizing that we are not centering people who are directly impacted in our work, and that if someone is currently incarcerated and need halal meat in their food, and that means pushing city council members to vote for a reform, I'm definitely going to do that for my client who's currently incarcerated. And like I say, and the road is to, inshallah, to get to abolition. And so I don't want to talk much, but I am looking forward to kind of maybe pushing ourselves a little bit into the uncomfortable balance of like, we must do reform, some kind of reform for people who are directly impacted to get to the end goal, which is abolition.
Thank you. And I'm glad you could make it. Jason, I have a question for you. As a philosopher, how do you see opinion of immigration generally, and open borders and abolition in particular, in the ivory tower? And do you see trickle-down opinion from philosophers, economists, etc., to activists and to people in general?
Yeah, another great question. Economics in general, when people work on this, they tend to argue that having something close to an open borders regime would be very economically efficient. And it's important for people who are allergic to the word efficient to recognize that that word in economics is a humanitarian word. A system is efficient when it's impossible to make one person better off without making another person worse off. The economics literature tends to estimate that the so-called deadweight loss of immigration restrictions is roughly cutting the world's economic production in half, which has massive distributional effects. It's responsible for a great deal of third world poverty. If we could eliminate borders, most people around the world would be much, much better off, and that would liberate them in all sorts of ways. So that's what the economics literature says. Philosophers oddly don't pay much attention to that. There's an unfortunate tendency to hyper-specialize in philosophy and every other field. I mean, a good example of this, an anecdote would be, I was at a conference one time, the American Philosophical Association, and a student asked a question about employment, and I asked, had anyone read this, the most famous paper ever written in economics about why employment exists? And none of the 100 very famous political philosophers there even knew about it. That's how the field tends to work. So that said, when you look inside political philosophy or philosophy in general, what you tend to find is sort of libertarian-minded philosophers tend to know the economics and trot those arguments out and make these kind of humanitarian arguments. When you look at the left, what you tend to see is sometimes people have the view that open borders would be bad for the rich countries and good for people in the poor countries, but we should do it out of obligation to them, even though it's a sacrifice, which there's an argument to be made that way, though I think empirically speaking, that's a mistake. It actually wouldn't hurt us, it would help us, it would help them too. But unfortunately, probably the most common thing is a kind of left-wing nationalism. Philosophy is dominated still by the work of John Rawls and his sort of disciples and his children, his intellectual children, and that view has a tendency to assume that matters of justice are national. If poor people live in our country, it's a problem. If poor people are ghettoized to another country, it's no longer really a concern of justice. And for that reason, they often will tend to reject them and focus more on looking at the gap between, say, fairly rich Americans compared to the ultra-rich Americans than being concerned about the difference between like someone in the United Kingdom versus someone in a very poor country. So I do think there's a large segment of open border people within philosophy. I think it's larger than what you see in the general population, but it's not as large as it should be, and it's in part ignorance of economics and in part the dominance of Rawlsian philosophy.
Great, thanks. Let's see, let's go back to Setareh. So the Detention Watch Network advocates the abolition of immigration detention. That's the specialty in my understanding. Do you favor other kinds of abolition, like enforcement, deportation? And then you talked a little bit about how those are related already. But what about the abolition of borders themselves? And another way of saying this question is this like an open borders versus no borders approach?
So in terms of an organization, DWN is membership based, and our mission right now is, as you said, to abolish immigration detention. And that was a decision that was adopted through a strategic planning process when we were founded in the late 90s. That was not the position, and we were very much focused on conditions. And it was a process to get to a place where, as an organization, we adopted a position of abolition. So we imagine a world where everyone is able to live and move freely, and a society where racial equity is the norm and immigration is not criminalized. And we recognize that immigration, that abolishing immigration detention is really part and parcel of struggles against racism, xenophobia, discriminatory policing, mass incarceration, and we see those struggles as very connected and coincided. But in terms of sort of official position, we are actually embarking again on a strategic planning process, and who knows what may come out of that. We do work with our members and our board and our staff to really think through and sort of arrive at our position. So I'm personally, I would love for us to adopt a position that's more broad, to include abolishing deportation and to include abolishing enforcement and open borders, but I think that's just a process that we have to go through as an organization. So we'll see. Maybe if folks join DWN, you can help us in that process. But I'm actually really looking forward to moving through that process with our members.
Thanks, Nathan. For you, how does legalization differ from abolition, and why is legalization not enough?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's also, there's a lot to unpack there. And I will again say that, I am someone who has lived through different legal statuses. I mean, I have the privilege of having legal status here. So I'll start with that. But I think it is a necessary step, but definitely not where we should work towards. And I think just when a challenge that I see is like when a lot of advocates in the space really define citizenship as the end goal, It's pretty narrow-minded, and I think we do not get to the solution of getting rid of, the roots of oppression. A lot of things are still rampant even when we have legalization. But I'll start with also, I think there's just a really long history of white supremacist, heteropatriarchal immigration policies in the US that have served to exclude people over and over again. Whether it's like the PAGE Act, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, that really like sets up our current immigration system as a continuation of kind of these really horrible policies, right? That have divided people into deserving, undeserving, or really set up this national security framework of seeing immigrants as either threats to safety or like good immigrants. And we really don't want this. And I think another challenge too is when we talk about legalization, we oftentimes fall into the legal and illegal paradigm, when in reality, we know actually there's so many more ways that the state has striated legal status, right? And a lot of people actually live in and occupy these liminally legal spaces with different wait times, different lived experiences, different access to benefits, different like prices they have to pay, different levels of precarity. And so when we talk about legalization, sometimes we also erase the lived experiences of these other folks who live in these like liminal legal spaces, right? And I think sometimes in pathways to legalization, we actually further empower and strengthen the criminal justice arm of the state as well. So I say that as someone who's applied for a U visa, right? I think part of that required cooperation with law enforcement. And even looking at the creation of the Violence Against Women Act, the arguments in Congress at the time for when it was like passed, a lot of it is like rhetoric around, strengthening the criminal justice and the criminalization approach to things. So I think that is to say that a lot of times we have to be really careful, and legalization, I think a lot of times it really just serves to uphold this model good immigrant that is legible to the state in this way. And we don't want that. And we don't want the fact that there's always exclusions, right? And that's part of like what lacks and fails with reforms, is that it always leaves people out and actually makes the people who are left out, make it harder for them to get where we want them to be. Whether it's looking again at criminal carve-outs, historically maybe how queer people, cross-dressers, people living with HIV, poor people have all been excluded over and over and over again, right? And most recently, I can also talk to kind of the problem of like immigration reform is that I think reforms really kill dreams. And we have seen, I think, over and over again how reforms don't work. Now with the Build Back Better plan, right? I think it really hurts me to see at the time when they announced, it was the whole big news around like how a pathway to citizenship was going to be included in the plan, and seeing a lot of the young people so excited, knowing that their lives or thinking that their lives or their parents or their families' lives would be transformed, but seeing so quickly how that proposal and that big talk was like watered down to like plan B, plan C, to now they're putting forth a parole in place kind of thing in the plan. And I think we really deserve so much better, and I think talking about just like thinking about legalization prevents us from thinking of ways in which we can go beyond that. And ultimately, I think being able to see beyond legalization also helps us to challenge the idea of citizenship and why it's so tied to the nation state, and why, at least in the US, but I think it's a broader phenomenon around the world too, why this legal form of citizenship is the main way through which we navigate the world, and why it's a status that has become such an important marker, indicator of who we are, what we can do, where we can go. And I don't think that that should be how things are. And ultimately, I think it helps us like move beyond to like, I think the rhetoric of like migration is that immigrants need a reason to move somewhere or to go somewhere. And I think, people should just be able to go wherever they want to, whenever they want to be with whoever they want to be with. But I'll end with a question, is that I think, it's easy for me to say all this on reflection, but it's also hard to balance these ideals with the day-to-day needs of immigrants whose lives can still be really wholly transformed through reforms. And I'm thinking about, for example, DACA, how I've seen that have a huge impact on, my friends, my peers, but how at the same time, I also know a lot of people who were left out of DACA just because of the specific date they came here or other circumstances. So yeah, that's my little spiel about why, to me, like legalization is definitely not enough and not our end goal.
Thank you. Mirna, I have another question for you. Do you see a difference? Is there a meaningful difference between refugees and other migrants, so-called economic migrants? Is that a meaningful distinction?
It's interesting you ask that. I've been just having a lot of feelings about I'm Arab. I'm from Lebanon, and so I've been having a lot of feelings about Arab Americans, quote unquote, who take up a lot of space in organizing spaces. And the reason why I mentioned that is because I kind of had to step back and think why I've been having a lot of feelings in these spaces in that way, because others who do claim these spaces are usually people who come from wealth or have had come here through privilege of getting access to some kind of visas. And even though there are still hard things to get, there are hierarchies of who can get what and how quickly can someone get through that path. And that's why actually, one of the million reasons why abolition exists, because we are complex human beings with a lot of privileges and also a lot of challenges that no legal any kind of law can capture these nuances and allow us to exist in a free world. But to say yes, there's big differences, and they are economical differences. They are just I don't think they're comparable in a way, because that, for example, it took me 12 years to get my citizenship, and I am today someone who has citizenship. But what I suffered through that legal process is I lost loved ones back home and I couldn't go and visit. I was not able to land a job, and I was homeless for a little bit because of asylum. Other people who came here on workers visa, on whichever H1B1 or UV, not you, I'm probably not saying the right names for them, but basically people who get hired by a corporation or some sort of job. So they're technically green card holders, they're technically immigrants, but they're very rich people with a lot of privileges and mobility. And so I think it does make a difference on what kind of path of crossing borders we take. Even though I took the hard path of being a refugee here, and it took a long time to apply for asylum and fit within the legal categories of whether my trauma was enough for the eyes of the agent at USCIS to keep me here. And that was really harsh. But also, I didn't cross it over on a boat like a lot of Syrian refugees have done, etc. And so it's very important to position ourselves in ways that we are less privileged than a lot of people, but also we are much more privileged than a lot of other folks. So I don't know if this answers it, but that's my take on it, that yes, there are big differences in how we come to cross borders.
Thanks. Thank you. With that, I think it's time to transition into our questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much, Paul. So 2 things to note. We're going to focus on questions, not comments. As much as we enjoy them, we're going to focus on the actual question rather than the longer comment. And then the other thing is please be mindful of our time. We will end at 2:15, and they can come back later for our next most excellent panel. So Luis Moreno asked the question. My question would be, why focus on abolition in borders, like in open borders and detention centers, and not on the root causes of forced migration in the global carceral system?
Should we just jump in? Because the open borders issue is much more important. It's like asking whether we should focus on like ending world hunger or focus on like a particular issue having to do with world hunger. The economic fallout from closed borders is cutting world product in half. Maybe only 25% on a more conservative estimate. It's unbelievably damaging. It's the most significant issue there is. It's more significant than climate change. The causes of this, it has problems, it has symptoms, including a global carceral system and the mistreatment of immigrants at borders and so on. But even if I could wave a magic wand and fix all of those problems, there would still be this massive humanitarian loss that's fundamentally borne by the world's poorest people, and further comes even at the expense of rich people like me. So I want to focus on the big issue, not something which is a symptom of that issue. I want to focus on the disease and not sort of a rash on the hand caused by that disease. So I think that's it. It's fundamentally, one thing is a lot bigger than the other. One thing is part of the problem, but it's not the problem.
Great, thank you. Do any of our other panelists, do they have any additional comments on this question? Let's wait. Maybe Nathan or Mirna or Setareh?
Yeah, I guess I could add something
Sure.
like brief. I think, and just to legalization, I don't think we reject legalization. I think it's part of the steps that are necessary to get to, like Jason was saying, like a bigger thing, right? Or a broader kind of like end goal. And I think we are, through this work, kind of addressing like root causes, right? Even, for example, the space we're being offered today, where we're able to hear about kind of like different folks' lived experiences to really build that solidarity and that understanding of where we're all situated in relation to this bigger issue, right? And how I think through the abolition of borders, we're able to also tackle other, like the smaller things like imperialism, intervention, capitalism, how we can start addressing some of those root causes through abolition of borders.
Mirna and Setareh, do you have any comments here?
I mean, I think I would just echo what's been said, that, you know, so much of migration is the result of global capitalism and imperialism. So there is no abolition without addressing those pieces as well. And it, you know, yeah, just to echo that.
Okay, so just to remind our viewers and attendees today that there is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen called Q&A. So if you just click on that, you can type into the box and we'd be happy to field your question. So I see a few more popping in, and while I read them, I'll start off with Ernesto's question, which is, he just broadly asked, do you think legalization is enough? And I think, you know, we've got a bit of that. Maybe if, you know, Setareh, you want to jump on and just talk about what you think about legalization specifically, and then we'll go to our next questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what Nathan said, I think it's not so much, you know, I think it's important that legalization is an avenue for many people to obtain relief. I think the problem is that it's not the whole thing, and it's not, and it does run the risk of like this good immigrant, bad immigrant dichotomy. And I think we just, I think it's the ways that we achieve legalization also that matter. So are we throwing certain communities under the bus? Are there certain exclusions that are actually going to make it harder for us to move forward our broader goals, right? Like, are there new criminal system contact exclusions that are on top of what already exists in the system that's going to create problems for us down the line? And how are we advocating in ways that you know, do help some of our community while not harming the rest of our community? So I think there's a lot of thinking and strategizing and asking questions that we need to do as we move this strategy. And I think the other piece of it that, you know, that I think we've all sadly realized over the last couple of weeks is like knowing who our friends are and who our friends aren't, and you know, how we're positioning ourselves, knowing that, you know, the fight is going to have to include, it is naturally going to include some compromise because of the way that our political system is set up. So how are we making those calculations in a way that that does provide relief but causes the least amount of harm, and recognizing that that's not where the fight ends, and that we have to hold all of our community members at the same time.
Great. So we have a number of questions coming through the Q&A. As a reminder, just please type them in and we'll get as many done as we can. So I'll read two of them. The first one is for Jason specifically. How can more academics be persuaded to consider or embrace open borders? And then Reverend Zelmer asked at the end, will this type of incrementalism help us move toward abolition? So maybe after Jason answers the first question, the other panelists can then address some of these other issues.
It's a great question, and I have to speculate because I'm too much of an empiricist when it comes to political psychology to just say if we just have good arguments, then that will change everybody's mind. It's unclear when people take positions how much of it has to do with the information they've exposed to, how much has to do with network effects and trying to fit in with the crowd, and crowds pick particular ideas as a way of sort of creating solidarity among them. It's unclear how much it has to do with just who happens to be situated at different universities and what influence they have over different journals. So, with all of that psychology and sociology in the background, I'd say if you want to create an academic world that's more friendly to open borders, what you need is the open borders people to be placed at the best universities, for them to edit the best journals, for them to have lots of grad students who get lots of jobs. And you also need good academic work that argues for these things on the basis of a wide variety of different values. One thing I like, my friend Brian Kaplan likes to say that open borders is the humanitarian, egalitarian, left-wing, right-wing, socialist, capitalist, humanitarian way to double world product. And he's right, because it's like, this is a case where all roads, intellectual roads, seem to lead to the same conclusion. I think that's helpful, but it's probably overly optimistic to say that all it takes is more and more good arguments published in more places and everyone will be persuaded. The reality is a lot of what we believe depends upon who our friends are and who has prestige rather than what the evidence is. And so you have to worry about that stuff too.
Hey, just to remind people, the question was about from Reverend Zilmer, will this type of incrementalism help us move towards abolition? So maybe some of the other panelists can address that.
If I may, I often think about this a lot because I feel like for me, speaking from an I statement, what I think is the problem or maybe the burden to get to abolition is that there isn't enough coordination between our vision as people who are working towards abolition, meaning there aren't a lot of shared visions. It doesn't have to be the same vision, but I feel like a lot of reform happens without that vision to get to abolition. And I really think that going as we are going right now as a humanity and as activists and as policy change makers, whoever does policy, I feel like we are not going to get to abolition. And that might sound harsh, I'm sorry, for people who are doing the work on the ground, but I feel like we really should be doing more coordinated efforts to get to abolition. The more of us are on the same page in that way, that we need to get to abolition, then I feel like we would be able to see more radical shifts within the legitimate legal channels of abolishing, erasing borders.
Great. So there's another question from an anonymous attendee, which is directed at Mirna and also at Setareh. Is the concept is in regards to capitalism? Is the concept of refugee versus economic migrant as bankrupt as the good versus bad immigrant binary? Or do you see the value of expanding the category of refugee to encompass more people, to be more humane?
I'm happy to go first if that's okay, Mirna. Yeah, I mean, I think, in some ways the concept of refugee itself is sort of bankrupt, right? I mean, I think it's the bare minimum of what we can do in the belly of the beast is to welcome and provide relief to people who have been forced to flee their homes because of the of the actions that our government has taken and the economic system under which we operate. So, you know, in that sense, like, should there even be refugees at all? Like, is the question for me. And then I think the other thing, and I say that as someone who was also a refugee for a time. So, you know, I think I do think in the way that we're operating right now, this idea of expanding refugee to include economic migrants who are impacted by capitalism, and you know, I think we have to include in that bucket also climate refugees, right? I think we can't ignore that piece, which is going to become more and more of an issue unless we deal with this climate crisis, which so far we have not. So I do think, you know, there's this question of, do we expand the category of refugee, or do we get rid of it altogether to allow for free movement? But I do think something has to change, because it's not encompassing the breadth of the problem.
See, Mirna, do you have anything to add to that, as that question was directed towards you as well?
Yeah, sure. I don't think I understand that question, because the use of the word as bankrupt, as you know, the good immigrant and bad immigrant, I think is something I'm not understanding. But maybe what I'd like to distinguish from or clarify from what I've said is that as someone who also was a refugee at some point, and now I'm not, I'm a citizen. It's weird to transition into and out of these identities. Is that it's important to within organizing spaces or within just existence is acknowledge each other's privileges, because we are not all the same, and not to say that one of us is entitled to things more than the other, or so. I'm talking about this from a non-legal perspective. In spaces, it's important to be aware of each other's privileges, like any other identities. But within the legal framework, I think it's also important to distinguish that, which is tricky, because for me, the reason why I want to get to abolition is that we don't fit into these buckets. It's like for me, the LGBTQI identities is like there are so many of the letters are not on that title, and there are so many of us who are migrating and crossing borders from very different walks of life that no law will capture. And so in a way, I don't want to see more expansion in the law, because I want to see the whole thing abolished. So I feel like I don't want us to expand on it in a way, but I do want us to talk about our differences outside of the legal framework, because there's no harm in that. But there is harm in putting us into boxes within the law, because very many of us will not fit these boxes, and they will be denied quote unquote benefits. And so that's why I believe we should just get rid of the whole thing. And that way we could accommodate each other as humans, rather than these little buckets that we put on paper, and make some people qualify and not. So that's my take.
Thank you. Nathan, you get the last question for this panel. So if you could briefly respond with about a minute's worth of response to a question from Luis. Why supporting DACA or DREAM Act when it excludes 94% of us undocumented immigrants, and not legalization for all 11 million? Huge question, but maybe if you give us a few thoughts over the next 60 seconds, that would be greatly appreciated. And then note to everybody else, our next session will start at 15 minutes, so please return for that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is a huge question, and I will say that I do support, like, obviously, legalization for all 11 million folks here. I think DACA, it was just like, you know, it's an unfortunate compromise, or like at the time it was like politically possible, you know, and I do see, I think I mentioned the effects that it had on people who now have DACA, but at the same time, I'm like, that's not enough. And to an extent, it also made folks who were excluded from DACA actually like have a harder time of like ever getting to a pathway towards citizenship. So I think it's always a balance. Like, we're talking about our end goal and the political realities of things versus like what can be achieved. And I don't have an answer to that. But obviously, I think we should be pushing for all, always.
That's a great note to end on, Nathan. And I want to thank everybody on the panel, Mirna, Setareh, Nathan, Paul, Jason, thank you very much for your time. And we will resume at 2:30 for the panel called Borders, Movements, and Violence. So thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you at the next panel. Bye.